Last year I flew into an Arctic radar station abandoned since 1993. The door was frozen solid. When I forced it, 71-degree air hit my face. The lights were on, coats on hooks still damp. No power grid for 300 miles. The generators were dry and seized. I was the only person to walk inside in 31 years. The coffee pot was warm. The station was part of the distant early warning line, a chain of 63 radar bases stretching across the frozen roof of North America, built in the 1950s to detect Soviet bombers. By 1993, they were all deactivated, left to the ice. My name is Robert Callan. I was hired to survey these remote sites for hazardous waste, documenting what the Cold War left behind. Most were just rusted shells. But when I flew into Fox 3, a station on the edge of the Beaufort Sea that hadn't seen a human in 3 decades, something was wrong before I even set foot inside. I landed at Fox 3 on the 9th of March. The flight in had been brutal, 3 hours in a Twin Otter with the heated cabin failing halfway, leaving me and my 2-man crew wrapped in sleeping bags and watching ice spiderweb across the windows. Below us was nothing but white. No roads, no settlements, no evidence that any human being had ever been there. Just the Beaufort Sea locked under 8 feet of pack ice and the endless flat light of the Arctic. Our pilot, a weathered Canadian named Terry who had been flying these routes since the 80s, pointed at a speck on the horizon. The station materialized out of the snow glare like a ship frozen in time. A long modular building raised on steel stilts above the permafrost, connected by a covered walkway to a smaller generator shed and a white geodesic radome that had long since stopped scanning the sky. The whole structure was half buried in drifted snow, the orange paint faded and peeling. Terry circled once, then set down on what we assumed was the old gravel airstrip. The skis cut through the crusted snow with a scream, and we jolted to a halt 300 yards from the main building. Silence. That was the first thing that hit me when I stepped out. Not the cold, which at -40 was a physical force that constricted your lungs, but the absolute silence. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of civilization, just a void. I remember thinking that the station looked like a grave. This was my 4th decommissioning survey for the agency, a joint U.S.-Canadian environmental remediation project tasked with cleaning up the toxic legacy of the DEW line before contaminated soil and PCBs could leach into the Arctic ecosystem. The job was grim work, cataloging rusted diesel generators leaking into the tundra, barrels of chemical waste frozen into the permafrost, asbestos-lined walls collapsing from decades of neglect. Most of the 63 stations had been stripped and sealed. A few had burned down. Many were just skeletons, but Fox 3, we had been told, was intact. The records showed it was evacuated in an emergency on March 22, 1993, and never re-entered. The final crew of 4 men had been airlifted out during a mechanical failure. They left everything behind. As I slogged through the snow toward the main entrance, I noted the details that made me uneasy. The exterior door was iced over but still secured. No pry marks, no signs of forced entry. The snow around the building was smooth and undisturbed, drifted in clean waves against the walls. Nobody had been here, but the thermal signature of the building on my handheld scanner was wrong. It was radiating heat. Terry stayed with the plane, keeping the engine warm. My survey partner, Ellis, a geologist in his late 40s who had worked cleanup jobs from Kuwait to Prudhoe Bay, joined me at the door. He tried the handle first. Nothing. The cold had welded the metal shut. I took a crowbar from my pack and wedged it into the seam. It took 3 full minutes of prying before the ice cracked and the door swung inward with a groan. Warm air spilled out. It fogged in the freezing air, billowing around us like the exhalation of something alive. I stepped inside and checked the temperature gauge on my coat. 71 degrees Fahrenheit. I looked at Ellis. He stared back, his face unreadable beneath his frost-trimmed balaclava. The lights were on. Fluorescent tubes humming overhead, casting flat institutional light down a long corridor lined with bulletin boards still pinned with yellowing duty rosters and cold war-era propaganda posters. The air smelled stale but not musty. There was coffee in it. We moved down the corridor into the common room. 4 chairs were still pushed back from a fold-out table. A playing card lay face down on the linoleum floor, the ace of spades. On the wall, a calendar was still turned to March of 1993, and on a row of hooks beside the door hung 4 parkas. Fur-trimmed military issue, the thick canvas still holding the shape of shoulders. I reached out and touched one. The fabric was cool on the surface but damp underneath, as if it had just been worn. Ellis found the coffee pot in the small galley kitchen. A battered percolator on a cold, hot plate, but the liquid inside was not frozen. It was lukewarm. He lifted the lid and the smell hit us, freshly brewed, not burnt or stale. I pulled out my field notebook and started documenting. Every detail needed to go into the report: the interior temperature, the lighting, the absence of water damage or rodent infestation. But the more I wrote, the less sense any of it made. The station had no external power source. No solar panels, no wind turbines, no connection to any grid. The radio mast had collapsed years ago. We followed the corridor to the generator room, expecting to find the answer. The diesel units were intact but dead. I checked the fuel lines, bone dry. I opened the inspection panel on the main unit and found rust blooms on the pistons, the block seized solid from decades of disuse. This generator had not run in 30 years. There was no other engine on site. And yet the light stayed on. The heat continued to cycle through the vents. I walked back to the common room, my mind cycling through rational explanations. Perhaps an automated geothermal system, but the permafrost made that impossible. A battery bank that somehow held a charge for 3 decades. No technology existed. I stood there in the warmth, staring at the 4 damp parkas on their hooks, the coffee pot steaming faintly in the kitchen, and the playing card on the floor that nobody had picked up since the last crew fled for their lives. Then I saw the logbook. It was open on a small desk near the radio console, the pages yellowed but intact. The last entry was dated March 22, 1993 at 0740 hours. The handwriting was brisk but legible, noting the mechanical failure and the order to evacuate. The closing line read, "Heat set to maintain. Lights left on, coffee fresh." Below that entry on the next page was another entry. It was dated March 12th of this year, and it read in the same handwriting, "Still waiting." I stared at that line so long the letters blurred. Ellis came up behind me and I pointed without speaking. He read it once, then again, and I watched the color drain from the only part of his face I could see around the balaclava. The date was March 12th. Our flight had landed that morning, but the entry had been made before we even took off from Inuvik. I checked my watch. It was now the 13th. Someone had been writing in this logbook yesterday. We did what any trained survey team would do. We searched every square inch of that station. Ellis took the east wing, I took the west. The architecture was simple. A single main corridor with branching rooms on either side, the classic DEW line modular layout designed for maximum efficiency and minimum heat loss. The floor was linoleum over concrete, the walls corrugated metal painted a sickly institutional green. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead in a continuous chain. Every switch I flipped worked. Every light came on. I found the break room, its shelves still stocked with tinned goods dating back to the Reagan administration, the labels faded but readable. I found a washroom with a tap that, when turned, sputtered brown water into the basin before running clear. The water was heated. How? The sleeping quarters were the most disturbing. 4 small rooms, each identical. A narrow cot, a footlocker, a metal desk bolted to the wall, and a closet with the door ajar. In the first room, the footlocker was open. Inside were wool socks, a deck of playing cards, a devotional pamphlet, and a framed photograph of a woman and 2 children standing in front of a suburban house somewhere warm. The glass was cracked. I picked it up and felt something cold crawl down my spine. The photograph was dated 1992. The woman's smile was frozen in time, unaware that the man who kept this beside his bed had been airlifted out in a panic and never came back. The next room held a parka on a hook, the 4th one, I realized, matching the 3 damp ones in the common area. I pulled it down and checked the tag. Canadian Forces issue 1987. The lining was damp just like the others. I held it up to the light and saw the size, large. I checked the 3 in the common area: medium, extra large, and small. 4 men of 4 completely different builds. And every coat was damp in the same places: the shoulders, the hood, the cuffs. As if each had been worn recently. As if someone had just hung them up. I met Ellis back in the common room. His face was pale beneath his goggles. He had found the radio room. The equipment was vintage, vacuum tubes and analog dials, but it was powered. The console was humming softly. The frequency was set to a dead channel from the Cold War, but the signal meter was twitching, as if receiving something just below the threshold of audibility. He had put on the headset and heard only static, but beneath the static he swore there was a rhythm, a pattern that almost sounded like breathing. We took samples. That was protocol. I collected vials of the coffee, sealed them in evidence bags, and labeled them with the time and date. I swabbed the rim of the pot for DNA. I cut a small square of damp fabric from the lining of each parka, bagged those too. We photographed everything, our camera flashes painting the walls with bursts of white light, freezing the impossible warmth in still images that would later be filed in a government archive and never looked at again. But we knew, even as we did it, that we were not going to find a rational explanation, because there was no power source. We spent 2 hours in the generator shed, the wind piling snow against the walls as we traced every line, every circuit, every junction box. The wiring was intact, the breakers were on, but where the current should have entered the building there was nothing. The generator was a cold, dead hunk of rust. The fuel tanks were empty, not a drop of diesel residue. I pulled up the floor panel in the common room to check the underfloor heating system. The coils were warm to the touch. I traced the line back to a central manifold that should have been fed by a boiler. The boiler was stone cold and bone dry. The warmth was coming from nowhere. This was the moment that my training failed me. I was a scientist. I believed in cause and effect, in measurable variables and predictable outcomes. But standing in that room with the thermometer reading 71 degrees, the lights humming, the coffee cooling to room temperature because we had unplugged the pot, I could not construct a single hypothesis that explained what we were experiencing. The laws of thermodynamics had been suspended inside this building. Ellis wanted to leave. He said it flat out, his voice cracking. He was 47 years old and had crawled through the aftermath of oil fires in Kuwait, had excavated mass graves in Bosnia for a UN cleanup crew, and I had never seen him afraid until that moment. He said there was no amount of hazard pay that justified spending another night in a place where the dead apparently still kept house. I told him we needed to finish the survey. It was my job to complete the environmental assessment, and I was not going to let a ghost story sabotage my career. But I was lying. I wanted to stay because I needed to understand. The logbook entry was not just a prank. The handwriting matched perfectly. I had held the 1993 entry beside the new one and compared every loop and cross of the pen. Identical. Unless a 90-year-old man had flown in undetected, broken into a frozen station, heated it to 71 degrees without any fuel, rewired a dead generator to produce phantom current, brewed a pot of coffee, hung 4 damp parkas on hooks, and then vanished into the tundra, I was dealing with something that had no explanation. We stayed. The Arctic night outside was absolute, the sun a pale smear on the horizon that would not fully rise for another month. The wind had picked up, rattling the walls and keening through the ventilation shafts. I sat at the table in the common room, the logbook open in front of me, and I paged backward through the entries. The final week of March 1993 was documented in the same brisk hand. The station chief, a man named Gerald Hartley, had noted rising tension among the crew. Small things, a door that would not stay latched, a radio transmission that arrived in a language none of them recognized, a shadow that passed the window when no one should have been outside. Then, on March 21st, an entry that made my blood turn to ice water. Hartley wrote that the youngest crewman, a radio operator named Thomas Koransky, had walked out into the storm in the middle of the night. They recovered him half a mile from the station, barefoot and nearly frozen, babbling about a voice on the radio. A voice that had told him to walk. A voice that had promised him warmth. The next day, the generator failed. They radioed for emergency extraction. The evacuation flight arrived within hours. They left everything exactly as it was, Hartley wrote, so that whoever returned would find the station ready. Ready for what, he did not say. I closed the logbook and looked at Ellis. He was watching the door, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The wind screamed outside. The lights flickered. Just once, so brief I might have imagined it. But I did not imagine Ellis's sharp intake of breath or the way his eyes met mine across the room. Something in the station had shifted, a subtle change in the pressure of the air, as if a door had opened somewhere deep inside the building. We did not sleep. We kept the lights on, of course, but we did not sleep. I sat with my back to the wall and my field knife open on the table, and I listened. The station was never truly silent. The heating system cycled, the wind moaned, and beneath it all, just at the edge of hearing, there was a low rhythmic pulse. It matched, I realized after hours of listening, the cadence of a human heart at rest. The hours crawled toward dawn. The heartbeat rhythm never stopped, a low thrum threading through the station's bones. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my sleep-deprived mind was inventing patterns, but every time I tried to ignore it, it would shift, speed up, slow down, as if responding to my attention. Ellis had curled into a chair with his emergency blanket pulled to his chin, his eyes wide and unblinking. Neither of us spoke. Words felt dangerous, like they might invite something to answer. Around 0400 hours, the radio console crackled. Just a burst of static, then silence. Then another burst. I got up and moved toward the radio room, my legs stiff from sitting motionless for hours. The console was still on, the signal meter dancing in the green. I put on the headset, expecting the same rhythmic static we had heard before. Instead, I heard a voice. It was faint, barely above the noise floor, but unmistakably human. A man speaking in a calm, almost conversational tone. He said one sentence, then the transmission cut. "They'll be back before the coffee gets cold." I ripped off the headset and stumbled back. Ellis saw my face and didn't ask. He just started packing his gear. We didn't have to discuss it. The station had crossed a line from unexplained to actively hostile. I keyed the satellite phone and raised Terry on the plane's radio. I told him we were scrubbing the remainder of the survey and needed extraction at first light. He didn't question it. The wind had died and we had a narrow weather window. He would have the plane ready. I spent the next 2 hours finishing the environmental sampling with mechanical efficiency, trying to hold on to some shred of professionalism. I took soil cores from beneath the generator shed, water samples from the melted snow outside, and wiped samples from interior surfaces for PCB testing. My hands were shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every shadow in the fluorescent light seemed to shift just outside my direct line of sight. When I passed the common room, I noticed the logbook was open to a different page than I had left it. I didn't stop to read it. I picked it up, stuffed it into an evidence bag, and sealed it. At first light, a gray wash of half-twilight, we dragged our packs to the door. I looked back one last time. The 4 parkas hung motionless on their hooks, still damp. The coffee pot